Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Day 2 of Transform, 10:35, so not too early, so hopefully most of you are recovered from last night. My name is Samantha Gadd. I'm here all the way from New Zealand. I'm the founder and co-CEO of Excellent. At Excellent, we're building a global community of EX designers, and we have a certification program, and we are also in the very early stages of building employee first tech, which is really exciting. I feel extremely lucky to be on this stage with these amazing humans. I feel like my entire career has led me to doing what I'm doing now. And in 2022, we had a huge highlight of, we pulled together an incredible group and wrote an employee experience manifesto for the world. And so today, this incredible panel is going to be touching on a couple of things in the manifesto. And if you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to have a look. So it's exmanifesto.com. You can bring it up on your phone. And what we attempted to do with the manifesto was to define employee experience design. We set out some values and some core principles. Because when you're building a company in this space, it's helpful if people understand what the space is. So I'm really delighted to be joined by these incredible professionals next to me, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So they're going to share their names, where they're from, and also maybe to kick off with the favourite aspect of the Employee Experience Manifesto.
Sounds good. Hey all, I'm Michael Merola. I'm the VP of Employee Experience at Shopify and previously spent time at Airbnb. I think my favorite part of the manifesto is actually just the word choice around enrichment not being extractive. And I think that there's a time that, employee experience, there was a little bit of confusion between like, is that amenities, is that entitlements, or is it actually enrichment? I love that we've called that out specifically.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, good morning. Lauren Serota. I am the head of talent development and oversee performance, learning, and people analytics at Patagonia. I've been at Patagonia for about 4 years. Live in Santa Barbara, originally from New York. I would say that the key principle from the EX manifesto that resonates with me most is the willingness and ability to have difficult conversations that bring value and trust in the organization. And one of the key reasons why I work for Patagonia and why I decided to work there is because we are a company that is willing to stand behind making really difficult decisions and live a life that is truly unexamined. And it's so meaningful to me personally, and I just feel so proud to work for Patagonia because we are willing to ask really tough questions. And I know many of you know this, but back in September of this year, our founder and our board and our leadership team made the difficult decision to give away our company to our only shareholder, which is our home planet. And because of that decision, woo! And because of that decision, it's really modeled the way for a lot of our employees to be able to have difficult conversations with each other, and it's internally reflected in the everyday experience.
That's really cool. Hey, I'm Chris. I'm a former Chief People Officer at a handful of startups. Most recently, I was at Intercom, and before that, a fintech startup called Affirm. And now I'm focused on advising entrepreneurs, HR leaders in startups, helping them scale and deal with challenges they have. I guess the thing that my most favorite piece of the manifesto, one, I think getting to go to Austin with a bunch of amazing people to build out this manifesto was a great opportunity and a great experience. I actually think that the principles themselves, I actually wrote them out, is really instructive and helpful because it actually gives everybody now a guide for how to do this work. We hear so much about employee experience and how you do it and what it looks like in human-centered design. Now there's a roadmap. And so I actually chose the third principle as my favorite. So alongside of employees, we support the continuous process of investigation, ideation, implementation. EX design is never finished. So taking these principles and applying them to the work that you're doing is now really a lot easier than before.
Thanks, Chris. And I also just want to shout out, there's a few other people in the room that were part of contributing to the EX Manifesto. So I can see Mark Levy, Jenny Basing, and Dean Carter back there as well. So thanks for being here today. My favourite part of the manifesto, I love it all, actually. It was a really hard document to write up when we had so many contributions from so many incredible people, but the piece that really sticks out for me is design with, not for. And the reason that sticks out is I've spent my entire career in HR and people and culture, and I know the pressures of being a leader in this space, and I know the pressures of feeling like the executive team or the CEO are looking to you to solve for all these really, really challenging workplace issues that frankly just have no playbook today. And you know, I vividly remember talking to a chief people officer probably about 7 months ago in New Zealand, and she came to this meeting literally with the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was telling me about 12 different initiatives that the executive team expected, you know, her to be leading out over the coming year. And I sort of looked at her and I said, you know that you don't have to have the answers to all those things. And in fact, you don't have the answers to those things, and the people in front of you do. And, you know, get people involved. And immediately when you sort of start talking about the fact that you don't have to have the answers, it just takes that pressure away. So being a leader in this space, I think that's a really important thing for us to all remember. I just want to dig into a couple of stories that these people have shared with me. So Michael, maybe I'll kick off with you. When we talk about being employee first, I absolutely love the way you talk about sort of remote first at Shopify. And I'd love you to share with us sort of how you encourage leaders to think about remote versus hybrid versus in the office, particularly in this current environment.
Yeah, I think, you know, we spend a lot of time focused on, in remote work or anything that's new, the challenges of these new things. And there's plenty of challenges with remote work for sure. I think that we really need to spend a lot more time focusing on the positives of decoupling your personal life from your employer's office location. I think this is a key part that often gets overlooked. And so if you think about a normal office, or you think about sort of a hybrid office, maybe you have to go in 2 or 3 times a month, or 1 or 2 times a week, or whatever it might be, you really have to limit yourself to a certain sort of reasonable driving distance or transportation distance to this location, right? And if you zoom out and look at that circle on the globe, that's like a very, very small dot that you're limited to. And I think we really gloss over just how impactful it is for people and individuals to remove that dot and say, hey, live where you want to live. You want to live on the West Coast, live on the West Coast. You want to go on the East Coast, go on the East Coast. You want to be in a liberal community, you want to be in a conservative community. These are your choices. Do you need to go and spend some time living near your parents to support them? Like, it's a very, very personal thing. And, you know, I don't mean to be like overly dramatic here, but I think it actually affects multiple generations, right? I mean, you imagine maybe a single person that's looking for a partner and wants to start a family. You know, if you're in that office or sort of hybrid thing, you're probably going to find that partner in that tiny little dot on that map, right? And you're probably going to purchase a home in that tiny little dot on that map. And you may have kids in that tiny dot on the map, and they're going to grow up in that dot, and they're going to develop their own friendships. I think location's like a big part of identity, right? I mean, this is a very, very personal, and I think private decision of where you want to be. And it really shouldn't be based on a dot on the map that is often defined by someone like me because I signed an office lease I got a good deal on, right? And so I think this is one of the things that I really like to think about and talk to leaders about. There are huge positives to this way of working. It's not simply being able to wear sweatpants every day, but that is a positive as well.
Thank you so much. I love that story that you share about kind of where our parents chose to live really impacting our lives, and I've never thought about it in that way, so thanks for sharing that, Michael. Actually, before I ask the next question, I do need to remind you, please use this QR code and ask questions, because we will have some time for questions before this session finishes. Chris, I'd love to throw it over to you. We have discussed many times how challenging it is to be employee first, particularly in this macroeconomic environment, an environment with mass layoffs. How do you work with leaders and encourage them to really think about employees in these current times?
Yeah. Maybe before I share a couple of thoughts, I actually would love to know who in the audience are currently HR operators? Okay, there's a lot of my people here. I like this. And then I imagine for those people who raise their hands, how many of you in the last couple of months have had to deal with layoffs, cost reduction, hard conversations, you know, all the things that we have to do. And for the other people who didn't raise their hand, I'm sure they've experienced that. So you know, like I do firsthand, balancing employee and organization is extremely hard. And applying some of these principles, like the X principles, like the ones that we're showing, is very, very challenging in a crisis. And so, why is that? It's because, transparency is more difficult, in these times. And there's also like this challenge of urgency that, again, if you've been in the seat, you need to have done this yesterday or tomorrow, and it's hard to involve people. So I've been chatting a lot with my advisees and CEOs, and I've basically been saying, if you're in crisis or if you've come upon a crisis, it's actually too late to be as employee-centered as you want to be. Of course, if you're doing a RIF, like you can do all of the best practices, and my colleagues up here can share some of them. You can be empathetic, you can be transparent, you can say, I don't know. You can do all those things, but you can't, I don't think, truly apply the X principles in a way that you want to. And in some organizations, frankly, I think just based on the structure, it's actually impossible to do because of how the leadership is set up and how people think about employee experience and how they want to own, information and data. So as a solution, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of coupling scenario planning with a process like employee experience so that you can help solve these problems for the future instead of being caught off guard. There was a 2000. This is my second year in HR in 2000. There was 2008. Now there's 2023. There's going to be 2000XX. So again, like as HR leaders, if we're tasked with being thought leaders and looking around the corner, we really shouldn't be caught off guard. And so how do you talk to your leaders and think about building the right approach for things like a RIF, even as an example, before it happens? How do you use the principles that we've been talking about in ways to drive inclusivity, to drive employee engagement, even in those tough times? That's what I've been mostly thinking about in the context of sort of this really challenging time that we're all in.
Thanks, Chris. Did either of you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the one thing that I would add is, not at Patagonia, but in some other companies that I've worked in, I've had to be at the center of making some really hard decisions, workforce layoffs, transitions. And I think the one thing is just the ability to do the right thing and to be able to have the most humane conversation as possible. What we're seeing a lot happening right now in the job market is if you are a company, you're at the center of doing that, using human-centered design thinking, and how do you have that dialogue as a guiding principle? Because the chances is if you do that, maybe that person is going to come back. I mean, there's peaks and valleys to when there's a lot of boomerangs, people coming back to working at companies. And so you want to be able to create that employee brand for people to leave and come back. And one of the things that I would like to talk to all of you today about is just gonna, and some of the things that I prepared was about this concept of work being extractive versus regenerative. And that's one of the EX design principles. But that the idea of, can we start to challenge the idea of the social contract of what that means with employees? The idea that the social contract with employees has a beginning and end in mind, I think is we're moving away from that. So just encourage all of you who are faced with making difficult decisions for your workforces to start to shift our mindsets around that.
And if I could just add, I think when you make decisions like this and when you do the right thing and when you apply these principles in these hard moments, this affects more than just your company. Other folks will follow. Whether because they want to do the right thing or because their employees say, why didn't you do what Patagonia did? Why didn't you do what Airbnb did, right? And so it really has a much bigger ripple effect than we might realize the individual decisions we make at our companies.
I totally agree with all of what you've just said. And I'd also like to add, I've led and seen many large restructures where many employees have unfortunately lost jobs over my career. And I've also seen these sort of change programs result in employees providing really positive feedback about the experience of that change, even when they lose their job. And that, I've not just seen that once, I've seen that multiple times, and that's when they've been treated really like a human, with as much transparency as possible, with as much information as possible, and as much detail as possible, so they can make really informed decisions. And so this stuff, even though it's really hard, there's a great way of going about it and a bad way of going about it. Yeah.
The quick point I just want to make is I think you point out, I mean, these are very progressive organizations, right, that would think this way. That would say, hey, we're doing a RIF and we're going to bring our employees and we're going to have a conversation. The reality is most organizations don't think that way. So what I was trying to sort of just highlight is maybe there's another way to actually get in front of it so that you can have a similar experience. So you can be the company that people look up to that say, hey, we did it like Patagonia, or hey, we should do it like X. And if you are proactive about the way you're thinking about even these tough conversations or these tough sort of programs, for lack of a better word, I think you can make some really interesting inroads and have a really actually positive employee experience, and then show maybe you become one of those progressive companies that Sam and Lauren are a part of, Michael is a part of.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks, Chris. I can see a question up here, and please do upvote these, because the thing with this Slido is that we only see the top 3 questions. So if you want your question to be asked, please make sure that you're upvoting it. And the top one at the moment is really related to the next question I was going to be asking Lauren. So Lauren, I absolutely love how Patagonia ask your employees a question around work being more enriching than it is extractive. And I'd love for you to share with everyone today, what's the question you ask, what do you learn, and what do you do with that information?
Yeah, great. So I would say for the past 50 years, Patagonia has really been one big experiment that has really been looking at how do we have a more enriching employee experience. And most recently, and thank you to Dean for really paving the way for us at Patagonia to ask the question, how can work give as much to employees as much as we ask them to give to us, or can we give even greater impact back into their lives? And so there's 2 key examples that I'd love to share with you. The first is blending what I call the inner and outer world. So for the past 48 hours in this conference, I've heard a lot of talk around sustainability, around social impact. And a big part of the employee experience in the first year is employees go on an onboarding journey, which was 90 days. Now we've extended it to 1 year, where they will go take a tour of a farm and learn about regenerative agricultural sustainability practices with the idea that's connected to our provisions, our food business. They will take the opportunity to go to a climbing or a surf class, spend time with our in-house resident philosopher to learn about Patagonia's ethos and our culture and who we are and where we came from. But the idea there is to blend the outer constructs of the 4 walls of work. What goes on in the outer world, in the natural world, in the conversation around climate change and climate action is as important into the work experience. And I do recognize by saying that Patagonia is positioned to be able to have those hard conversations at work. Another practical example is, I've heard a lot of talk in the past 48 hours around all these amazing things that companies are doing to wed purpose and profit. But one of the questions I ask myself every day in my job is how do you actually make that happen? How do you invite difficult conversations? We hire to values at Patagonia, and we hire to those values so people can experience to live those values out in their everyday work experience. But having those difficult conversations at work is not easy. I don't know about many of you, but for me, even having a difficult conversation with my mom or my partner can be really tough. So how do you invite that into the workplace? So one of the key things that we've been really focused on is building the capability and skill to offer a perspective of what does a difficult conversation look like. So when you break it down, to have a conversation about climate change or social injustice in the workplace or political action requires a lot of vulnerability and requires us to be really open and honest with each other. And for some of us, it could be really triggering. So what we're doing is offering every quarter learning opportunities for all employees, frontline and for corporate, no matter where you sit in the world, to be able to partake in having an understanding and a framework of a difficult conversation. And then I would say the third example of how we're thinking about regenerative principles and enriching in the employee experience is this idea I was referring to earlier of the social contract. No longer the idea that there's a beginning and end in mind in the employee experience, but in that the idea is that when one is in service of Patagonia and they retire, a couple of years ago, we established something called the Emeritus Council, which is where people who have left the organization are now mentors to people in the organization and are still able to partake in the environmental initiatives and still be a part of our culture. We did a survey and we asked a lot of the people that were in service of the company, what's the number one thing that you're looking forward to when you retire? You would think that they would say, not working, I want to be as far away from this company as possible. But really what they were looking to do is give back. So just encourage all of us to be thinking that way, even for the people that are leaving. I would say the last thing is one of the things that we're learning along the way as we're doing this is that being able to instill having an enriching experience over something that's less extractive is a really hard thing to do, and it requires, again, that EX principle of having difficult conversations and being able to do that in the most inclusive way. And the biggest thing that I'm learning is to be able to do that through to do that through networks. It cannot come just from HR, but the ability to build networks internally that are able to model those changes throughout the organization is really critical.
Thanks, Lauren. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that? Guys, we'll keep going. I can see some really great questions coming up here. The one that I just saw, which has now disappeared, was something around how you seek feedback. How do you continue to seek feedback and get that information from employees without constantly spamming them with surveys? I'd love to know if any of you have got any perspectives on that.
Just a quick thought, and I'm glad you can read it because it's too small for me to read, so you're going to have to keep reading these things out loud. I think it's always funny when you get sort of the survey from an airline or a bank or something that says, hey, would you continue to be a customer, or would you refer someone to be a customer? And this is an easier thing to do, right? Which is see, do they in fact continue to be a customer? Do they in fact refer a customer? And so I think that if you look at a lot of the data analytics like power that often companies put into the product they have out there is really trying to get that type of attention internally, right? And so you can do all the surveys you want, but I think we also have to really observe what the behaviors are. If we have a new program and they're participating in it, how does that impact longevity of their tenure and things like that? So I think really focusing on getting some of the data analytic power is really key.
I was just going to say, when you co-design with employees, you have a built-in group to continue to get feedback from. And then you also, which is really cool, have champions who are out in the organization who are actually in the organization, that are separate from the hierarchy and from the exec team. So they're getting the real information from their peers. And so again, leveraging some of these these practices, you're building in a feedback loop automatically.
And I'd add one more thing to that as well. I really feel like we're moving from a time of people and culture to, I believe the next era might be individuals and experience. I really feel like we can't look at people as one group with one set of needs, and we need to start deeply understanding the individuals in our organizations. And to do that, we need to be asking individuals about themselves. We need to get our managers to have those conversations, to ask their people what matters to them, what's impacting them, what's getting in their way, why they joined, why they stay, all those great questions. And often a survey isn't going to be the best way to gather that information. So I feel like one great way of kind of continuously getting that data is to have your managers be the ears on the ground for you. I'm just having a look. There's another question up here around, actually it's disappeared now again, but it was about how do you reduce benefits, not necessarily healthcare, and how do you have those conversations with employees because of financial pressures?
It's a bit out of my wheelhouse, but I think one thing I would add is a little bit continuing with what you just said, right? Is if you think about flexibility, rather than having many programs that target specific things, wherever you can provide flexibility so you're able to serve as many needs as possible, right? And so that might end up looking like a stipend in some places that you choose to spend on what in fact is most important to you as an individual, your family, or whatever your situation is. And oftentimes there can be many piles of benefits that only a small percentage take advantage of. I know that's not that easy. There are some things depending on where you are in the world and then the state you're in, the country you're in, that you need to do differently. But I think the more flexible it is, I think the lighter the blow it is to take away one program here or one program there. It's definitely not my wheelhouse. I don't know if you guys have anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's actually pretty company specific. So whoever asked that question, I'm happy to talk to you more and understand sort of the scenario to understand sort of what the trade-offs might be. But it really depends on the scenario and the situation and sort of how deep of a crisis the company is in. I mean, again, I would rather maybe talk about and pass it back to some of my colleagues about how you have that conversation, not so much like what sort of the process looks like. And it goes back to some of the things around being employee-centered, asking employees what's most important, as a first step, which is kind of sometimes novel if you think about it. But the reality is sometimes you need to balance these with the company, back to employee versus company. And I always talk about it as a full investment. And at the end of the day, there's only so much we can invest. And I've only worked in the last 15 years in private companies, so not making any money. So there's always that part of the conversation where it's like, remember, we're not making any money here. We're trying to be a profitable business. We need to keep that in the context as we think through how we talk about all the investments we're making. Benefits is just one of them, in my opinion.
And I would also add that, get your employees involved in ways to save money. So if you've asked the employees the question of how do we reduce our, operating costs, they'll have ideas about what matters least to them, and then you don't need to worry so much about how to get buy-in for the decision you've made because you've done it with your employees. I'd really recommend that approach. Now, I love this question, and I've got a bit of a guess about who asked it, but it's been asked, what was the most hotly sort of contested aspect of the Employee Experience Manifesto, and how did we navigate that? And I might take this first, but I'd love your perspectives after that. So when we had sort of around 34 contributors to the manifesto, and some really big brains and a very diverse group of people as well. And I would say the most hotly contested aspect was the value employee first over customer first. And I really, really wrestled with this. And my co-founder in the front here, Jenny, knows how much I wrestled with this because we actually had 3 incredible contributors pull out because I kept that value in. And they pulled out because 2 of them pulled out because their company has a value, customer first. And so they felt like they couldn't have their name signed to something that sort of said the opposite. But I really absolutely deeply believe that this is one of the most important parts of the manifesto. And the reason being is organisations need people, but people don't need organisations. And we know that because the gig economy is growing at 3 times the rate of the US workforce. Employees or people can provide value directly to customers without organisations now. The only role for an organisation is to provide value to employees because employees provide value to customers. It's almost impossible for an organisation to provide value directly to customers. So therefore, the role is to put employee first, in my view. It was hotly contested. It was really challenging. I was also, personally, I'm a massive people pleaser. So it was very difficult to choose a value that I knew some people that I deeply respect would have to pull out because of. But today I'm very glad I stood by that. I'd love to know if any of you had any thoughts around, that final version that went by and what you thought about that.
I thought that was for sure the one that got sort of the most traffic in the Google Doc for sure. For the obvious reasons. But as you can imagine, this was a couple of days of workshop plus a bunch of additional conversation to get this down to the place where it is in a succinct way. I think it was really an incredible feat. There was lots of debate and conversation for sure. But the EX folks did a great job.
We've just got a minute and a half left, and I'd love to answer the question here that asks sort of, does the manifesto require specific actions, or is it a pledge, or kind of how do you kind of move forward with it? And what I would suggest is a really good place to start with the EX manifesto is to take it, read it, and have conversations with your leaders about where they think your organisation sits against the values and principles defined within the EX manifesto. And the reality is every leader, every organisation is on a spectrum from being extremely employee-centred to being extremely org-centred. And I've always felt my job as a leader in this space is to just nudge every organisation that I interact with a little bit up that spectrum, and over time we can really make a big difference and have more and more organisations being employee-centred, but it's not going to happen overnight. So my advice is to take that EX manifesto, please co-sign it if you haven't already. We've had, in the first 10 days of it being published, we had people in 24 countries co-sign, which just absolutely blew me away. So please co-sign, share your feedback, and then share it with others in your organisation. I'd love to take these last few seconds to ask, what would you all recommend people do with it?
Yeah, I would love to speak to this because I wasn't a part of the original group for the EX Manifesto. One of the members of my team had gone on that journey, and so I'm on the receiving end of that. So I am happy to kind of take a couple of seconds to speak to that. And so when this person from my team came back from Austin with this awesome group of people, I was like, wow, what's this manifesto? That sounds amazing. And without really having a lot of knowledge of it, this person provided a lot of education and awareness around what the EX Manifesto was. But the key question we really asked ourselves is like, how do we customize this for Patagonia? And also to know that like the EX Manifesto, in my mind, it's an evolution of a lot of pre-existing ideas that are out there, but really crystallizes it in a new framework, which I think is just an awesome way of thinking about it. But what we did is we looked at, okay, what are the things that we're doing today that align to some of these guiding principles in the EX Manifesto? And then what is some of the guidance that it's out there that we're not doing? And then what's the shifts that are required to get to this new way of thinking? The other thing that we're doing is we're upskilling our senior executive team to have an understanding of EX design principles. It's something that is fairly new to us, and we're just continuing along the journey to learn from each other and all the great work, Sam, that you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're actually out of time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I really appreciate everyone joining us. I would suggest, I know these three really well, and also I know for myself, we're all really open for the questions that we didn't get to, for you to reach out to us on LinkedIn and ask those questions. And I love having conversations with anyone that's an EX enthusiast, so please reach out to me. And thank you so much. Thanks, guys.